bumblebee collecting nectar from red clover flowers, Charles Darwin researched these same red clover flowers and how bees affected how many seeds these red clover flowers produced more than 130 years ago. Bumblebees returning to the nest, 2 bumblebees fanning the nest entrance hole, honeybees on a Canada thistle flower through the microscope. Canada thistle is a horrible weed, but it has deliciously tasty nectar which honeybees love to drink. Up close, rear legs, abdomen, stinger, mouth parts, mason bee homes, a male mason bee, two male bees on a cosmos flower in the morning, more than 10 male bees on plant stems early in the morning, 5 male Melisodes bees at about 8 a.m. in the morning after having slept the night together, whereas female bees usually spend their night inside the nest. Male bees of many different species often spend the night sleeping together on flower heads or plant stems. 2 female bees collecting pollen from a sunflower in August 2009. You can see lots of orange-colored pollen grains on the hind legs of both of these 2 female bees, which they will carry back to their nest to supply their nest with. Sunflower pollen through a microscope. Female leafcutter bees entering and leaving their nests. Female leafcutter bees usually spend their nights inside their nests. And in this case, their nests are these holes I drilled in wood. The next day, 3 of the holes were filled. Lots of different size holes in wood. 2 female leafcutter bees who've made their nests right next to each other. A Carder bee displacing 2 mating damselflies. A sweat bee. Simple eyes, ocelli, and compound eye. All of the bees and wasps we see on this film have 3 simple eyes between 2 much larger compound eyes. A yellow jacket wasp, paper wasp, compound eye, we see some of its many lenses. A cuckoo wasp. I saved this cuckoo wasp's life. It was drowning in one of my backyard ponds, and I lifted it out of the pond, filmed it through the microscope, and then I let it fly away. Drinking nectar from fennel flowers. A mud dauber wasp cleaning its curled antennae on my front porch. Collecting mud next to one of my backyard ponds. Paper wasps made a nest inside a pipe in my backyard. Here are two paper wasps, possibly exchanging food, definitely communicating with their very sensitive antennae. Collecting wood from a wooden stool, collecting water from a pond, drinking sweet nectar from fennel flowers, the entrance hole to an underground yellow jacket wasp nest 2001, an above ground yellow jacket wasp nest 2004, the entrance hole to another underground yellow jacket wasp nest 2009, a yellow jacket wasp fanning the nest entrance hole after heavy rains, a leucospid wasp. That is not a stinger tucked up above its abdomen. That's an egg layer and ovipositor. It uses that to stick an egg into a bee's nest. Pushes that ovipositor into the wood and injects an egg into a bee's nest. And this bee doesn't seem to like to see this leucospid wasp in its neighborhood. Chapter 1, Bumblebees. A queen bumblebee chose to make a nest inside a white plastic barrel here in my backyard, in which I drilled a little hole for a completely other reason. But a queen bumblebee had started her nest inside this white barrel, and by the time we're seeing them here, there must be, 50 worker bumblebees or so inside the nest, as well as the queen. Antenna of a bumblebee. Face of a bumblebee. Rear leg. Comb on leg combs pollen. Bumblebee legs have lots of hairs. Here is a bumblebee collecting nectar and pollen from a red clover flower head. Side view of a different red clover flower head. Each red clover flower head has about 60 flowers on it, and that bumblebee is trying to collect nectar from as many flowers as it can. And it returns to the nest with the nectar and pollen. A bumblebee has a long tongue, allows it to collect nectar, which is down at the bottom of those red clover flowers. Sticks its tongue way down to the bottom of the red clover flowers and sucks up the nectar. A honeybee has a shorter tongue and has a hard time collecting nectar at the bottom of red clover flowers. One summer, Charles Darwin put nets over 100 red clover flower heads, and he left 100 red clover flower heads uncovered. And at the end of the summer, he collected all of those red clover flower heads and the seeds that they'd produced. And the 100 red clover flower heads that were covered with nets produced no seeds, and the 100 red clover flower heads that were not covered with nets produced about 2,700 seeds. And Charles Darwin theorized that it was bee pollination that resulted in the much greater number of seeds produced by red clover flower heads that were not covered by nets. He ended up publishing a book in 1876 titled The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization in the Vegetable Kingdom, about that and other related subjects, and it's still a worthwhile book. Here is a bumblebee collecting nectar and pollen from lupin flowers in the springtime in May. Bumblebees tend to collect nectar and pollen from one type of flower. For example, one bumblebee might collect nectar and pollen from red clover flowers time after time. So one bumblebee gets good at collecting nectar and pollen from one type of flower. Scientists call that flower constancy. Another bumblebee might get expert at collecting nectar and pollen from lupin flowers, so it'd go to many different lupin flowers collecting nectar and pollen. Of course, different times of the spring and summer, there are different types of flowers blooming, so bumblebees do collect nectar and pollen from different kinds of flowers. Evolutionarily, it helps flowers to have the same bee go to the same type of flower to pollinate other flowers of the same species. Here is a bumblebee fanning the nest entrance hole. All of the bumblebees inside the nest are breathing in and using oxygen from the air and then exhaling carbon dioxide gas. So the air inside the nest can get dangerously high in carbon dioxide gas. So one of the reasons these two bumblebees may be fanning the nest entrance hole is to fan highly oxygenated air into the nest. They can also be doing it to cool off the nest on a hot summer day. If you look carefully, you can sometimes see a bumblebee inside the nest fanning as well. Bumblebees remind me of panda bears, adorable, furry, endearing, determined creatures. And although each worker bumblebee does have a stinger, I have never been stung by a bumblebee, and you really have to harass a bumblebee to get it to sting you, and I do not harass bumblebees. One last look at a bumblebee collecting nectar and pollen from a red clover flowerhead. Bumblebees are strong and they've got muscles. Chapter 2, Honeybees. Compound eye of a honeybee. All honeybees do have 2 compound eyes and 3 simple eyes, and each compound eye has between 5 and 6,000 separate lenses, and there are hundreds of hairs between the lenses of the compound eye. And each of the hairs is connected to a nerve cell. So a honeybee can feel when something is touching its compound eye. Compound eye of another honeybee. Branched hairs collect more pollen. Rear legs, pollen basket. Abdomen. Stinger. Barbs on the stinger. Mouth parts, tongue. Wing. Hooks on hind wing, and the hooks on the hind wing connect with a little flap on the back part of the front wing. So when a honeybee is flying, the front wing and hind wing are connected, and the honeybee flies as if it has 2 wings rather than 4 wings. These honeybees are collecting nectar from Canada thistle flowers. Canada thistle is native to Europe and Asia, and its seeds were brought as contaminants of crop seeds to Canada in the 1700s. And now Canada thistle is a horrible weed throughout much of Canada and through most of the northern United States. One of the reasons it's such a successful weed is that it has incredibly delicious and tasty nectar, which honeybees love to drink. Honeybees thereby pollinate the Canada thistle flowers, thereby producing lots of healthy seeds. Chapter 3, Mason Bees, making their homes in 5/16" diameter holes in wood. A male mason bee its 3 simple eyes between its 2 much larger compound eyes. This mason bee has lots of mites on its thorax and abdomen. These are mite nymphs, non-feeding stage of their life cycle. They're just catching a free ride on this mason bee. Chapter 4, Male Bees in Morning Spent Night Together. Here we are seeing about 7 male Melisodes bees in my front yard on these 2 flower heads at about 8 a.m. in the morning. And as we said in the introduction, male bees of many different species often spend the night sleeping together on flower heads or plant stems, whereas female bees usually spend their night sleeping inside their nest. Seven years later, in August 2008, 5 male Melisodes bees are sleeping and waking up here on a flower head at about 8 a.m. in the morning. Female Melisodes bees usually make a nest in a burrow in a hole in the ground. And there are more than 100 different species of Melisodes bees in North America, but most people don't even know they exist. These bees are sometimes called longhorn bees because the male bees have long antennae, such as you see here, and they clean themselves up very carefully. Each bee has literally thousands of sensory nerves on their antennae and on the surface of their body. The male bees particularly need to be able to sense a female bee's pheromones, her chemical scent she gives off, because the male bee is trying to find a female bee. A few days later, I had found that this yellow spider had caught and wrapped up 2 bees, just a few feet from where the male bees had been sleeping. Chapter 5, Bees Collecting Pollen and or Nectar from a Sunflower. In August 2009, as we said in the introduction, these 2 bees are female bees and each has thousands of orange-colored pollen grains packed on her rear legs. The larger bee is probably a Melisodes bee. The smaller one is harder to tell. Notice the larger bee is kind of doing looks like a little dance to pack the orange pollen grains she's collecting onto her rear legs. Each of these bees will then presumably fly back to her nest and provision her nest with the pollen and or nectar she has collected. As we said, the Melisodes bee makes a nest in a burrow in the ground, and she will provision the nest with pollen and nectar, then lay one egg on the pollen nectar mass, and when the egg hatches, the bee larva will eat the high protein pollen and nectar for its food. The smaller bee seems to be mostly eating the pollen grains, whereas the larger bee is collecting the pollen and looks like it's drinking some nectar. Sunflower pollen grains through the microscope. Those spikes make it more likely that the pollen grain will stick to a bee's body and be carried to a different sunflower and pollinate another sunflower. We are seeing this sunflower in August 2009. There are 3 bees on it here. I think 2 of these bees with the long antennae are male bees, because as we said earlier, male bees usually have longer antennae, and these bees seem to be mostly drinking nectar from this sunflower and not collecting pollen grains. Male bees usually don't collect pollen. Chapter 6, Leafcutter Bee, Female at Nest. This leafcutter bee has brought back some green leafy material to her nest hole and is chewing up the green leaf material. Leafcutter bees use green leaf material to both separate their cells inside their nest and to close off their nest. It's a good reason why they're called leafcutter bees. Now, leafcutter bees usually pack their pollen on the underside of their abdomen on little hairs called the scopa, whereas honeybees and bumblebees usually pack their pollen grains on their hind legs on what are called pollen baskets. The next day, 3 of the holes are filled. Lots of different sized holes in wood attract lots of different kinds of bees. These are smaller holes. They're actually 5 32nd inch diameter holes in wood, whereas the previous leafcutter bees we saw were in twice as large diameter holes, were in 5 16th inch diameter holes in wood. These are not baby leafcutter bees. These are a different variety of leafcutter bees. There are lots of different leafcutter bees in our world. Leafcutter bees are solitary bees, which means that each female leafcutter bee makes its own nest, collects pollen and nectar for its own nest, it then usually closes up the nest hole with green leaf material. They often build nests one beside the other, but they don't work together. to provision their nests. In fact, sometimes they have little disagreements. Watch what happens here. This female leafcutter bee goes down the other leafcutter bee's nest hole to see what's happening there. Chapter 7, Damselflies and Carder Bee. Here comes a carder bee and displaced the mating damselflies. A carder bee collects hairs from leaves such as this and then builds a nest using the leaf hairs. We're just going to see this carder bee for a few brief moments before it flies off. Chapter 8, Sweat Bee. Simple eyes, ocelli, compound eye. As we said in the introduction, all bees and wasps have 3 simple eyes between their 2 much larger compound eyes. Sweat bees are beautiful bees. Some are a beautiful green, as we see here. Some are blue. Gorgeous bees. Chapter 9, Cuckoo Wasp. As I said in the introduction, I saved this cuckoo wasp's life. It was drowning in one of my backyard ponds. I scooped the wasp out of the pond, let it dry out, brought it inside, and the next day filmed it through the microscope, which we see here. Later that day, I took it outside and it flew away. A female cuckoo wasp lays an egg in another bee or wasp's nest, and when the cuckoo wasp egg hatches, the larva eats the bee's egg or larva and or the food provided for the bee larva. So by saving this cuckoo wasp's life, I may have ended a bee's life. A cuckoo wasp drinking nectar from fennel flowers. Chapter 10, Mud Dauber Wasp. Here is a mud dauber wasp cleaning its curled antennae on my front porch in June. Here is a mud dauber wasp collecting mud next to one of my backyard ponds 2 months later in August. A mud dauber wasp collects balls of mud, flies off, builds a mud nest, and builds a little mud cell, then catches a spider, paralyzes a spider, stuffs it in the mud cell, then goes and catches another spider, paralyzes that spider, then flies back to the mud cell, stuffs it in the mud cell. Eventually, the mud dauber wasp catches and paralyzes several spiders and has them stuffed in its mud cell nest. Then it lays one egg on one of the paralyzed spiders, closes up the mud cell with some more balls of mud. Then, when its egg hatches, the wasp larva eats the paralyzed but live spiders for its nutritious food. I never saw exactly where the mud dauber wasp was constructing its mud nest, so I don't have pictures of the mud nest. But I've read fascinating accounts of others who have observed and photographed mud dauber wasp nests. I've seen mud dauber wasps collecting mud next to the same backyard pond for 5 years now. Chapter 11, Paper Wasps. A queen paper wasp chose to make a nest inside this metal pipe in my backyard that used to be part of a clothesline pole. By the time we see them here in July of 2009, there are 4 or 5 paper wasps living on this nest. But only newly emerged and fertilized queen paper wasps survive the winter. The newly emerged and fertilized queen wasps at the end of the summer choose a hole in the ground or some other safe place to hibernate during the cold autumn and winter months. All of the female worker paper wasps, the old queen paper wasps, and all of the male paper wasps die off by wintertime, and only the newly fertilized queen paper wasps survive the winter, hibernating in a hole in the ground or underneath a pile of leaves. And in the springtime, a queen paper wasp flies away from her hibernation hole and looks for a place to start a nest. And in this case, a queen wasp chose a pipe in my backyard. Dr. Mary Jane West Eberhard, a staff scientist with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute based in Costa Rica, and unquestionably a paper wasp expert who has studied paper wasps for more than 40 years, watched this paper wasp chapter and wrote to me, "Guess what? You have a male Polistes in there too. The male is the one with curly tips on his antennae. Even though the nest is quite small, it is fairly old, as indicated by the length of its cells." One flies away. And here we see a paper wasp drinking sweet nectar from fennel flowers. Paper wasps catch insects, and they specialize in catching caterpillars, and they chew up the insects and fly back and feed the chewed up insects to their offspring, to their larvae. But for their own food, they don't eat the chewed up insects themselves, the adults. For their own food, they mostly drink nectar from flowers, such as you see here. They also get some food from their larvae. After they give their larvae chewed up insects, the larvae often give them back some nutritious fluid. And a queen paper wasp can decide whether to lay a fertilized egg, which will develop into a female paper wasp, or she can choose to lay an unfertilized egg, which will develop into a male paper wasp. Usually she only lays the unfertilized eggs at the end of the season. Here you see a paper wasp chewing wood from a wooden stool on my patio roof. In order to enlarge the paper nest, paper wasps need to chew some wood fibers. And I have observed paper wasps chewing wood fibers from the same wooden stool on my patio roof for about 8 years now. They usually walk very gradually backwards as they chew the wood fiber from the wooden stool. In order to enlarge the paper nest, in addition to wood fibers, they need water. And here you see several paper wasps attempting to land on the surface of one of my ponds, and they can definitely land on the surface of the pond. If you look carefully, often before they take off, they will twiddle their antennae right there. So with both wood fibers and water, they can enlarge the paper nest. Now the wasp who's perched atop the paper nest there is the one male paper wasp, which Dr. Mary Jane West Eberhardt so expertly pointed out. He has slightly curled tips to his antennae, and the two front legs of each paper wasp have an antenna cleaner basically at the first elbow that allow the wasp to clean each of its antennae. And it is very important that the antennae be kept clean, as each antenna has hundreds of nerve cells which are used to sense touch, taste, smell, chemicals in the air, and much more. These paper wasps are called Polistes dominulus. This type of paper wasp is native to Europe and Asia and was first seen in the United States in 1980. And now it's quite common in several parts of the United States. Paper wasps are beneficial in many ways. They catch lots of pestiferous insects. All female paper wasps have a stinger, both the queen paper wasp and the female worker wasps. Male paper wasps do not have a stinger, but paper wasps rarely sting. I observed these paper wasps for many hours, and they never even threatened me, even though I was only a few feet away from them. So please don't destroy their nests unless you absolutely have to. Here the paper wasps go into what I call a freeze mode. They froze here for about 5 minutes. 15 years earlier, here is a queen paper wasp. There are her 2 compound eyes and 3 simple eyes. It's a close-up view of one of her compound eyes, so you can see some of its lenses. And here's that same paper wasp juggling her nest. If you look carefully, you can see one little white egg in almost every cell there. She juggled the nest, and then I let her and her nest go. Chapter 12, Yellow Jacket Wasps, 2001. A queen yellow jacket wasp started a nest here just south of my house, about a foot, in 2001. There, and by the time we are seeing them here in September, there are several hundred worker yellow jacket wasps inside that underground nest. The life cycle is similar to the paper wasps we saw in the previous chapter, except, and this is a big except yellow jacket wasps make a much larger nest. And it's usually underground, such as the case here. The queen usually chooses an abandoned rodent hole, and this was probably an abandoned rat hole. So the queen yellow jacket wasp starts a nest underground. She lays eggs. She feeds her larvae chewed up insects, which she catches, and then the larvae turn into pupae, and then adult worker female yellow jacket wasps, and they continue the work of the colony, and the queen can stay underground in the nest laying eggs for the rest of the summer, and the worker yellow jackets do all of the foraging for food for the young, and they do a lot of excavating, carrying out lots of little pieces of dirt so they can make their underground paper nest larger. And they collect the wood fibers and the water. I set up the camera about 6 inches from their nest entrance hole, and they didn't like me being there, but they only stung me once, and I filmed them for more than 6 hours over 3 days. There's usually 1 or 2 guard yellow jackets at the entrance hole there. You see 2 guard yellow jackets. There's 1 guard yellow jacket trying to stop that one. No, as with paper wasps, yellow jacket wasps are beneficial in many ways, catching lots of insect pests. But especially late in the summer, they can also come to human picnics and drink soda, fruit juice, juice from meat at a barbecue, and they can be a nuisance in those situations. But typically, if you don't swing at them or harass them, they usually won't sting you, but they sometimes do get feisty. Here is a yellow jacket drinking sweet nectar from fennel flowers. Very similar to the way we saw a paper wasp drinking sweet nectar. Through the microscope, 3 simple eyes between its 2 large compound eyes. I do recommend that you take photos of your camera setup, and you'll hear a click right about here. I took some photos of the camera as I was filming it so that I'd be able to see exactly how I had set it up. Chapter 13, Yellow Jacket Wasps, 2004. This is my sister's front porch, and yellow jacket wasps made a nest hanging from the ceiling of my sister's front porch, and she lives about 1 mile from my house in Portland, Oregon, and we're seeing them here in July. The only problem was my sister's mail carrier refused to deliver mail to my sister's mail slot, which was also in that porch area. So after I filmed these wasps, my sister reluctantly called an exterminator, and the exterminator came and destroyed the nest. You'll see several wasps moving slowly backward, and they are adding to the paper nest. And there are different colors to the nest, because each time a yellow jacket collects wood from a stool or a board or a dead tree or a live tree, it's a slightly different color, so you can see several different colors that make up that paper nest. Chapter 14, Yellow Jacket Wasps, 2009. 5 years later, yellow jacket wasps constructed an underground nest in my front yard. And here we are seeing them in June. we'll see them on 10 different days in June, July, August, and into September. And here they're working very hard to enlarge their underground paper nest, and in order to do that they need to carry out hundreds of little balls of dirt and rock and wood from their underground area so they can enlarge their paper nest. Sometimes they try to fly out with a piece of dirt that's a little bit too large. Now we are seeing them in July. I was not stung by these yellow jacket wasps while I was filming them over a period of about 2.5 months. You see that yellow jacket wasp trying to carry that huge piece of dirt or wood, get a little help there. These yellow jacket wasps are a different species than we saw in an underground nest on the side of my house in 2001. These are Vespula vulgaris, and these yellow jackets are actually one of the most common wasps found in Europe, and they are also found throughout the United States and Canada. The yellow jacket wasps we saw on the side of my house in 2001 are Vespula pennsylvanica, which are not found in Europe and are found in the western United States. Their life cycles are very similar. Here we are in August, and there's a little ant walking up to the nest entrance hole there. Now September. There's a yellow jacket wasp fanning the nest entrance hole there, and a wasp fanning there. We are seeing them here after the 2 rainiest days of the summer. They're probably fanning the nest entrance to help dry it out. In order to try to illuminate the bottom part of the nest entrance hole, I'm using an LED light to try to let you see some of what's going on down toward the bottom of the nest entrance hole there. Chapter 15, Leucospid Wasp. As I said in the introduction, that's not a stinger tucked up above its abdomen. That's an egg layer, also called an ovipositor. And this leucospid wasp uses that egg layer to inject an egg through the wood into a bee's nest, as you see it doing there. So this is a parasitic wasp. There are lots of parasitic wasps in our world. There are actually many very small parasitic wasps. This is one of the larger parasitic wasps. I had seen these wasps several times over the past few years, but it was hard to film one because these wasps move in such an unpredictable way. We are seeing this wasp in August 2008. It's using its very sensitive antennae to try to locate a bee's nest that will be good to inject an egg into. Here we will see it unsheathe this ovipositor again. Right there. And that ovipositor is very thin. It's like a hypodermic needle, and it sticks that ovipositor through the wood and injects an egg into a bee's nest. And when the leucospid wasp egg hatches, the wasp larva eats the bee egg, larva, and or the pollen and nectar provided for the bee larva. Here you see two female leucospid wasps sort of messing with each other. One scientist has found that leucospid wasps often reproduce without mating. They often lay an egg even though they have not mated with a male leucospid wasp. That quite often they reproduce what's called parthenogenetically. I think the bee realizes that the leucospid wasp is up to no good as far as the bee is concerned. And a different bumblebee collecting nectar from the same red clover flower head. What is different about this bumblebee?